My name is Marcia Greenberger. I was born in Philadelphia. I should say my name is Marcia Devins Greenberger. I was born in 1946, and it is now 2019, and I am celebrating my 50th wedding anniversary. And when I got married in 1969 in Philadelphia, it didn't occur to me that I could have the option of not changing my name.
There you go. Times have changed.
Times have changed.
Do you want to give us a little background about your background, about what kind of family you came from, maybe their ethnicity, and what life was like as a little girl and then growing up?
Well, I grew up in a very middle-class life in Philadelphia. My grandparents all four were Russian Jewish immigrants. And my maternal grandfather died before I was born. That's who I'm named after. His name was Marcia.
Yes.
So I never knew him, but my maternal grandmother, although she never lived with us, was very much a part of our life growing up. And Jenny, and she was the person who sewed clothes for us and cooked all of the ethnic Jewish specialties from the part of Russia where she was from, and told us the stories on her side of the family. My father's parents had a corner grocery store in the South Philadelphia part of Philadelphia. And we would visit them every Sunday, and it was a great treat because we would go into the store and they would have candies and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And one of the great disappointments in my life was to learn after my father died that one of my colleagues, Judy Waxman, grew up in that South Philadelphia neighborhood and knew my grandparents.
Oh my goodness.
And she used to go into their store as a little girl and just buy something after school. And because, of course, they knew her family and they knew her, they just got put on the tab.
How wonderful. How wonderful. That's
Yes,
a great
well,
story.
it was very wonderful to learn that. As I said, I was only sorry that she couldn't tell my father, because he would have burst with pride to know that she remembered them and
Nice.
that they were a part of her life.
Excellent. So did you go to public schools?
I went to public school. I went to the neighborhood elementary school and junior high school. I walked to school. I took public transportation to the junior high school, and then in 9th grade, I went to the Philadelphia High School for Girls, which was a public school, but it was an all-academic high school citywide, and there was a boys' high school, Central High School, a block away, that was the equivalent for boys.
Okay.
And that was actually, looking back on it, something that shaped my life quite a bit, and by that high school experience and the emphasis on succeeding, although I was a product of the 50s and I graduated from high school in 1963, and most of the girls in my class expected to be teachers or nurses, etc. And although it turned out that an African-American woman, Shirley Franklin, was a graduate of my high school, and
Excellent.
many other quite accomplished people ended up having gone to my high school, including Gloria Allred, another one.
Oh my goodness, another lawyer.
So they produced
Right.
young women who had a sense of their own skills and their own capabilities, even though the expectations were that those skills and capabilities would be fulfilled in narrow lanes.
Right. What about siblings?
I have and had, growing up, 2 sisters. I was the middle one. There was 5 years between each of us. So in a certain sense, by the time I was born, my older sister was off in school, and I was off in school when my younger sister was born. I felt very squeezed because when my younger sister was born, I moved and shared a bedroom with my older sister, which neither of us particularly liked. And then, as my older sister got older and my younger sister was no longer a baby, she moved with me to share a room, and my older sister got that room to herself.
See, you were squeezed.
So that to me just epitomized what it meant to be in the middle. But the truth of the matter was, my sisters were very important to me, of course, then as they are now. And my older sister was one of my great mentors, and I went to law school at a time when very few women did, and she was very, very supportive of that and very supportive of me and boosting my ego, etc. My mother, as the New York Times now calls it, is a stay-at-home parent. And my father was a public school teacher. He taught in the Philadelphia public school system, but he also taught in the evening program at Temple University. He was a mathematician. And both my older and younger sisters became math majors in college. There was never any question that I would go to college. And my parents were very clear that they expected that we would get good grades, that we would achieve, and there was from the beginning a sense also that math was not out of bounds, that women and girls could be just as good at math as boys could be. And as I said, my two sisters were math majors. I will never forget in second grade, in the early first report period, flunked math in second grade. Now, what that was all about, I cannot tell you, but my father was very clear that that was not going to stand. And so he tutored me and tutored me and tutored me, and that continued through calculus, etc. But I became a history major and cared about politics and government. My parents were very liberal Democrats and very politically aware. I would come home from school and the McCarthy hearings were on TV. We had those kinds of discussions. I remember debates about Lyndon Johnson and Medicare and Medicaid, which they were very much in favor of. My father was in favor of unions for public school teachers. So one of the big shocks in my life was going to elementary school, and of course my family was for Adlai Stevenson, and finding out that almost all the other kids were for Eisenhower. And I had no idea that I was in the minority by being for Adlai Stevenson. So that was an early lesson in the fact that elections don't always go my way.
There you go.
So I was in high school during the Kennedy administration, and that to me was just the utter epitome of glamour and fabulous, sort of wonderland. If you could only work in Washington and be a part of government and an administration like the Kennedy administration. I was a freshman in college when he was assassinated and devastated, as of course was everybody, and have very clear recollections of exactly where I was and exactly what I was doing. My high school, as I said, was very empowering, but within these narrow constraints, we had almost no sports programs for the girls, but we did send cheerleaders that block away to Central High School for their teams, and at the time, that did not particularly faze me. There was a case brought against the Philadelphia public school system after I went to law school and when I was working on women's rights in Washington in the 70s, challenging the inequalities between Girls High and Central. And in the first case was brought under the Constitution, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, and saying separate can't be equal, without much of a factual record. And the court, basically, there was one justice who didn't participate, 4-4. They sort of left the status quo in place.
Right.
The Women's Law Project in Philadelphia, which still very much exists, then brought the same case under the State Equal Rights Amendment, which existed in Pennsylvania.
Right.
And they developed the record.
Okay.
And that's when I learned Central had a much bigger library. Central had teachers with advanced degrees more than Girls High faculty had. Central had a fund that alumni had developed for all kinds of enrichment programs, and Girls High did not have those kinds of resources. And of course the athletic programs, as I said, were completely and totally unequal. So even though I thought I got a wonderful education at Girls High, and I did, and had wonderful teachers, by many, many objective measures, Central High School for Boys was a far more endowed and enriched program than Girls High was, as it was called. I eventually, because of that lawsuit, Central had to accept girls, and so they did, and so there were many girls that went to Central after that case in the 70s. The Philadelphia High School for Girls, as it was officially called, then said it would accept boys, and there were a few that applied. But by and large, there were very few male students who wanted to go to a school called Philadelphia High School for Girls, reflecting a difference in status, of course.
Of course, right. What's your earliest recollection before this of becoming aware of sexism? It sounds like you had a pretty wonderful family in terms of their response to you as girls. But when do you remember when you became aware of the differences or any differences?
Well, I certainly was aware of differences, and one of the things, having three girls, was it wasn't in my face every day growing up by any means.
Right.
And my mother's sister was very, very close, and she had two girls too, so I had two female cousins, and that was a unit that was very much, so I wasn't seeing, the boys go do this and the girls, you go do that at home so much, but still there were expectations, as I said, when I went to college at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, and they did not have a school of education that gave an undergraduate degree in teaching. But you could take extra credits beyond what you needed to get your bachelor's degree for teaching that would allow you to get a certificate to be able to teach in Pennsylvania. And I went for summer school to get those credits because I figured that, that was what I would end up probably doing and becoming a history teacher in the public schools. And I certainly knew that the boys that were thinking in terms of many more careers and many more options.
Right.
And also, while we belonged to the conservative branch of Judaism, and that was not as I'm going to say liberal in its rules as the Reform movement, but not as rigid in its rules as the Orthodox movement. And so I was one of the first classes where they had girls be bat mitzvahed at the age 13.
Excellent.
Which was equivalent to boys being bar mitzvahed. But the girls could not read from the Torah, which was the holiest book. And so there were 3 of us doing it on a Friday night. We couldn't do it on a Saturday when the boys were bar mitzvahed. And we read from what's called the Haftorah, but not the Torah.
Okay.
And those there have been reforms since then. And certainly I knew that, never even dawned on me there could ever be such a thing as a woman rabbi in those days. And so I just was aware of these very clear lines and distinctions of what girls did, what men and women did. When we came home for lunch in the Philadelphia public school system, and so we would walk home for lunch. And I think about that, and I tell young women now that that was the way the school system was set up, because there was an assumption that there would be a mother home in the middle of the day making lunch. And in 6th grade, and my mother was, and nobody's father was home, but everybody's mother. And this was very much of a middle class, row houses, neighborhood. As I said, my father was a public school teacher. This was not a wealthy area by any means where we were living. And in 6th grade, I had a friend, and she used to go to a neighborhood diner for lunch, and I thought that was the coolest thing. And I asked my mother if I could go with her, and she said fine. And it turned out her mom was working and had a job and couldn't be home in the middle of the day at noon, and then again at 3 when she came home from the, there wasn't after school care or anything like that in those days.
Sports,
or sports or after school activities. They just didn't really have that. And also my mother didn't learn to drive until I was 5 years old. I talked about my father's parents, my grandparents' corner candy store. We had little neighborhood groceries and butcher shop and bakery, and my mother would go every day or two and buy things fresh for the day. And we had a refrigerator, but it was small. And we didn't have very much frozen food or anything of that sort. So it was a very labor-intensive job to have a deal with. And we did not have a clothes dryer for many, many years, etc. So she was, it was a very hard-working existence, that's for sure, to be that quote-unquote stay-at-home parent. Anyway, when I went to college and became a history major, as I said, I went to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And
so you lived at home while you were going to school?
Well, I commuted in the very beginning, but I really wanted to live at school and have a dormitory life. And that was, while there were certainly a fair number of commuting students that went to Penn, the bulk of the student body was residential. And at the time there were limits on the women's dorms, and there were women's dorms and men's dorms. And there wasn't space for me to live on the dorms. And when I said how much I remember when John Kennedy died, I'd had an appointment with somebody at the housing office, and I'd been practicing for a month to make my case about how long my commute was, how hard it was for me to go to the library, how important it was for me to be able to live in the dorms. And I'm practicing my advocacy skills, and I'm sitting outside her office waiting for my time. And she came rushing out, and she said to me, "I'm really sorry I can't possibly meet with you now, you understand," and just left. And of course I didn't understand at all.
No.
I had no idea what in the world it was. I got on the subway to begin my commute home, and that's when I heard that Kennedy had been shot.
Oh my goodness.
And everybody in the subway, of course, was in tears and upset, and it's shocking even to this day to think about it. But I do think about how I just was dumbfounded. I couldn't say, but wait, I didn't say anything. So I went through with my history major, and I had a very prominent member of the history department who was my senior thesis advisor, and I asked him for advice because by my sophomore year I was able to get a room on the dorms, and so I did live on campus my final 3 years.
Okay.
And I loved college. I loved all my courses. I loved the freedom of it. I loved the intellectual aspects of taking a course in opera or a course in or English classes or the history classes. I loved being around students all the time. Now, it is also true, I noticed that in our sophomore year, some of the women in my part of the dorms wanted to have a women's crew team. And everybody laughed at them. That was the most ridiculous thing they'd ever heard of. And crew was a very big sport at Penn. It's right on the Schuylkill River. There are these beautiful boathouses, and Penn has its own boathouse, and crew was just part of the Philadelphia tradition. But the idea that women would have a crew team was ridiculous and laughable. To go fast forward, my younger daughter went to Penn undergrad, and at her dorm, which had been the men's dorm and was really one of the historic buildings at the time, and there she was in the men's dorm, then she's quite tall. And as we were helping her move in, these young women approach her and say, "You want to join the crew team?"
Oh my God.
And I thought, oh, I've lived and gone to heaven. Here she is in this men's dorm, which we always thought was so cool and tradition-laden, that they didn't have women. And secondly, how great it was that they had all these sports teams. When I went to Penn, as a liberal arts major, I was accepted to the College for Women. There is a college for men. The College for Women was a third the size of the college. There was also Wharton undergrad, there was a School of Engineering, there was also a nursing school, which was mostly women, but by and large, the campus ratio was 5-to-1 men to women.
Wow.
And we knew that. And we all said, isn't it great? We're smarter than the guys. We had to be smarter to get in. Now, Penn never had its College for Women named the way Radcliffe did for Harvard or Pembroke did for Brown in those days. And that was true for a number of schools where the College for Women had a separate name, separate admissions criteria, etc. And by and large, it was harder to be accepted as a woman than it would be as a young man getting in, and we just accepted it as a fact of life. Another thing we accepted was that the women had curfews, and the male students did not. And one of my dear friends and those curfews weren't a joke. If you were a few minutes late, that went on your record. And if you had too many of those overdue times, you could be seriously disciplined. And this friend of mine was not appropriately signed out for a weekend. Now, the men had, from freshman year, had no curfews, no sign in, sign out, none of that. She, as a senior, hadn't signed out properly. Not that her parents objected, but she hadn't signed out properly. And they were not going to let her graduate.
Oh my goodness.
So this was not anything. And by then, we were very outraged by that. We had to wear skirts to dinner in the dorms. We had to wear skirts to classes. We were allowed to wear pants in the library on Sunday, but that was it. Those rules got looser over time, but that's, we had to be ladylike. And this history professor of mine, when I said that I just wanted to stay in school and I was thinking about getting a PhD in history and teaching history in college rather than teaching at a high school level, he said, well, I think you should think long and hard about going through for a PhD program, because that can take 6 years and sometimes even more. And without a PhD, you're going to end up with a master's degree, and then you will only be able to teach in high school anyway.
Okay.
And probably you will get married and have children, and you'll never finish that PhD.
Right.
So is this something you really want to do? And at the time I thought, that's a serious consideration. I had 2 dear girlfriends who decided they were going to go to law school. And they said, I need to come too. And this is great. I did not know any lawyers growing up. My neighborhood, it was not that kind of income level.
Got it.
Where there were the professional lawyers, etc., that I knew. And I never had thought about that, although going back again to the Kennedy administration, loving government, thinking to myself, oh my goodness, what could be more wonderful than somehow working in the government and public policy. Law, I knew enough, sounded like it could be related. So I thought, law school's 3 years, not 6 years.
Amazing.
I know how to take tests. That's all you have to do in law school. I can just take tests. I don't have to write a dissertation. And you had many stories of people who just froze over the dissertation, and they finished their coursework, but they never got to their dissertation, never finished it, and that scared me. So I thought, well, I could give it a try, and if worse came to worse and I didn't finish it, I'd go teach, because I had my 2 teaching degree that would let me teach, and so I'd be okay. So anyway, I did apply for PhD programs, and I applied to law school, and I ended up getting more financial aid for law school than the PhD programs, and so that was that.
Oh,
that was
the
like
decider.
That was the decider for sure. And so I went to law school with my 2 girlfriends. Now I have to tell you something else about the period of the 60s.
So what year are you going to law? What year did you graduate?
I graduated from college in 67.
67.
The Vietnam War was raging.
Right.
And when I was a senior and we were applying to law school, graduate school deferments were in place. So middle-class guys were able to get out of the war by going to graduate schools or law school or whatever. And as a result, most middle-class guys did not go to the war, into the war. I went to take the LSAT, the standardized test to apply to law school with my 2 girlfriends, the 3 of us, the 3 musketeers, marching arm in arm together. And these guys came screaming at us, why are you taking this LSAT? You're going to take a seat away from some guy who really needs the degree, and you're going to send him to the war. And I should also say that at this time, by then, I was thinking about law school, and we were really accosted. The unfairness of the differential treatment between male and female students in admissions, in these curfews, etc. That was bugging me. There were many things by the time I was finishing college that led to my sense that the difference in treatment was really not putting women on a pedestal, as a court case said. It was putting women in a cage, these differences. So we weren't just being treated differently because we were being so respected like crazy. We were being put into these separate lanes and separate roles that were going to be diminished in status and economic wherewithal and the like. So I did go to law school, and I was about to say also as a history major at Penn. This was not in some rural area. This was not biophysics. This is a history major.
Mm-hmm.
I never had one female professor my entire 4 years at Penn.
Amazing.
And I only realized that that was the case when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was nominated to the Supreme Court, and a wonderful woman lawyer, Janet Benschoof, a women's rights and reproductive rights lawyer, said that when she had Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a teacher in law school, that was the first female faculty member she'd ever had through college and law school. And that made me stop and think, oh my God, how could that be? And then I realized I never had one at Penn, undergrad or law school. My whole 7 years, I never had a female law professor. Now, there were obviously some, but so few that I never had any.
Right.
In fact, Elizabeth Warren was at Penn for a brief time. I didn't have her, but before she went to Harvard, before she was stolen away to Harvard, she was there. At my law school class, which began in the fall of 1967, and I skipped over the activism of the time, the civil rights movement developing, the anti-war movement developing, there were sit-ins, etc., and the leaders were all male on campus. And that was something that I experienced. And Mark Rudd at Columbia, that was my era as well. So I went to Penn Law School, and the class was about 250 people when we started, and there were maybe 10 or 12 women in our law school class.
Did all the Three Musketeers make it?
The Three Musketeers went to law school. One of the three went to Penn with me and has remained. I'm in touch with them to this day, and they became quite successful practicing lawyers themselves.
Right.
And the second one did not go to Penn Law School. So, and they ended up in corporate practice, and very, very supportive of the route that I took to this day. In any event, the fall of my first year in law school, the fall of 1967, the Vietnam War had heated up so much that Johnson took graduate school deferments away.
Oh, right.
And that's when everything erupted, because the middle class could no longer avoid being drafted and going to war. Also, first year law students no longer could stay in law school because there was no longer a deferment.
Right.
So our class went from about 250 people to about 110 or 20.
Amazing.
So the women became 10 out of 120 rather than 10 out of 250.
Makes a difference.
And after our year, many more women started to come to law school, and I think it was a confluence of the women's movement, of expanded notions of the women who started to go, of law schools probably looking at their bottom line and thinking these women were able to stay and having you can see and pay, and you could see the pattern in history of Rosie the Riveter, and after every, the women doing things during wartime and then being pushed back and resisting. And in law school, that replicated itself as it did with other professions during that period of time too.
Excellent, yeah.
So I finished law school, but when I started, the women were completely visible. There were so few of us, everybody knew who we were.
Right.
We were called on for the rape cases.
Really?
And
amazing.
And we were raised and given a hard time. I loved law school. I had great friends that I made both male and female. I met my husband now of almost 50 years. He was in my first year class.
Okay.
So
Another benefit?
standing out can have its benefits as well as its detriments.
Right.
But one of the, sort of the raps that we had to contend with was we were in law school to meet a husband. We were never going to practice. We were never serious about it. We were taking the seat before it wasn't a deferment anymore. We were taking a seat from a much more deserving male. Then we were taking a seat from somebody who was really going to practice law and deserved to practice law. And so here I am, and we're there to meet our husband.
Right.
So there I am meeting my husband and feeling as if this is not anything that I want to have out and about. So we tried, except for our best friends, to keep this relationship very much under wraps, and came back after our second year married, and we were very pleased, and a lot of people had no idea. So I had a job at a private law firm my second year, and as I mentioned, I changed my name, and I just assumed, of course, that's what I would do.
Yes.
So I came back in my third year with a different name, and I went into the practice in the law firm, and that was a new job. I said my second year, but it was really my third year. I didn't mind changing my name because everybody in law school knew what my real name was. But I was very upset that here I was at a law firm, and they didn't know me as anybody but Marcia Greenberger. They didn't know I wasn't really Marcia Greenberger.
Right.
I was really Marcia Devins. I was
Right.
just saying I was Marcia Greenberger.
Yes, I know that.
And
feeling.
I realized then how important my name was to my identity. But after having changed it, the idea of going back and unchanging it, I didn't do that, and I had my law degree in that name,
Right.
and I just kept it. When you say what else sort of raised my consciousness, and I better skip over all the other things, or we'll be here in time for dinner and tomorrow morning. One of the things that was quite dramatic was the lack of interest by many law firms and many employers in women law grads.
Right.
I remember that my husband we came to Washington. He had a clerkship with a federal judge on the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia, a wonderful man,
Is that how
Carl
you came to
McGowan,
Washington?
and that is how we came to Washington. We expected to live in Philadelphia, and I was so mortified that I'd never lived anywhere but Philadelphia through growing up, through undergraduate, through law school, that at least that year in Washington, that would be exciting. So he took that job, and I started interviewing. First of all, the faculty are very important in helping steer you to particular judges.
Right.
And a number of the faculty said that I would have a difficult time getting a clerkship because many judges did not want women clerks. And one judge said, I can't have a woman clerk because my secretary, who I've had for decades, would never be a secretary for a young woman clerk and do
goodness.
her work. There was a story of somebody who told me that they didn't think that Thurgood Marshall would ever take a woman because he curses all the time, and obviously he couldn't curse in front of a woman. And so a judge who did have this superstar woman called up Thurgood Marshall and said, she is a superstar, you must take her. And she survived the cursing. He loved her. She became, I think, one of the first tenured law professor at Yale.
Wonderful.
And brilliant, wonderful woman. But there were just myths where some of the judges, like Thurgood Marshall, would have been willing to, but people assumed, oh, of course we can't promote women because they would never take them. Sometimes they wouldn't. I went to several different law firms to apply for a job, and there was one law firm I remember, and the partner said to me, we've never had a woman lawyer, and we really can't. And I said, why not? And he said, well, Washington is not a safe city. There is so much crime, and our young associates work really late at night. And so what if something happened to you? We could never forgive ourselves.
Right.
So I walked out of the hall, and in those days, it was before computers, and they were all night typing pools.
Oh my gosh, sure.
For these big law firms, so that when they finished a draft and hand corrected the next draft, that all-night typing pool would have a fresh, clean draft ready for them in the morning. Well, guess who was working in those all-night? The women.
Those women.
And they seemed to be able to take those risks with safety, and those partners never seemed to think that they could never forgive themselves. And it occurred to me when I was in that hallway that there was this all-night typing pool working away for that law firm.
Beautiful.
And I didn't march myself back into that partner's office and tell him I could do with whatever security they offered for those women, it would be fine with me. And I never forgave myself for that. I've told that story many times. I was not the most aggressive or assertive person, but I was getting angrier and angrier. I did take a job as the first woman associate at a wonderful tax firm. And to skip forward, through a variety of circumstances, Arthur Goldberg ended up working with that law firm and using some of the associates to work on cases with him. And so I had the opportunity to work with Arthur Goldberg, who of course had been a Supreme Court Justice and Secretary of Labor in the Kennedy administration, and on. An extraordinary person. And he took me seriously, and he edited my work, and he went over what I needed to do and how to do better. And he was really a wonderful, wonderful mentor. Well, he had agreed to chair the board of one of the early public interest law firms, the Center for Law and Social Policy. And it was set up in 1969. And the whole point of it was to provide representation, legal representation for unrepresented groups, like people who cared about the environment. They didn't, if you care about clean water and clean air, you don't have the money to go hire a lawyer to represent you, but the industry has money to represent its interests. If you consumer protection, same problem, etc. So those were the kinds of issues that the Center for Law and Social Policy was working on. And it had an arrangement with 5 law schools where students would get a semester of credit, law students, for working at the Center for Law and Social Policy. Well, it was basically all male students, and the support staff were women, many college graduate women, of course, who thought, were channeled into these administrative jobs. The law students, there were beginning to be more women, and some of those law students were women, and they had a revolt in 1972. Okay. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had started to bring her cases, and she had won the first one under the Equal Protection Clause in 1971. And there were Bella Abzug was starting in the summer of 1972. Title IX was passed. Bella Abzug and some of the other women in Congress were starting to introduce legislation to prohibit sex discrimination. Name change issues were beginning to come to the fore, etc. So these female law students and administrative support staff had a revolt, and they had 4 demands. 1, they wanted more women lawyers to be hired. 2, they wanted to have the center work on women's rights issues and start a women's rights project. 3, they wanted to be paid better instead of being paid in what they thought were unfairly because their jobs were quote unquote women's jobs. And 4, no more serving coffee. So the young guys who were at the Center for Law and Social Policy were very willing to do it. And they said fine. And so Arthur Goldberg told me, because he was the chair of the board, about this, and I heard about it in other ways. And I always wanted to do public policy and public interest. And so I ended up interviewing and getting the job to start a women's rights project.
Beautiful.
And so I began and was able to get some foundation funding, and then we were able to hire a second lawyer, Lois Schiffer. At the same time, they had hired another woman lawyer to work on health law issues and other issues at the center, Margie Cohn, whose heart was in women's rights. And so I got her, interest, and we began to work on women's health issues. And since she was working on health issues, that was okay. And work on some of the issues that other lawyers at the center were involved in. And so we grew. When the Carter administration came in,
1976,
Lois Schiffer left to work in the Justice Department. And so we hired Nancy Duff Campbell to come. And she had a background in welfare law and poverty law and the effects on women. And so she was able to develop our work in that area in particular. And by 1981, we had become half the size of the Center for Law and Social Policy, and it didn't make sense to be a project anymore. And so we became the National Women's Law Center.
So that's the birth.
And at the time, Patsy Mink was on our board, and we were debating what kind of name, and we were thinking of cute names or silly names, and we thought, we'll do Women's Law Center. And then she said, put national in front of it because that makes you sound important. And so we put National Women's Law Center, and when we started, it was such a generic sounding name that people would say, oh, I've heard of you. So we thought, well, we picked something good because it was the kind of thing that sounded like, oh, well, we've been there for a long time. So that's how we began. I stepped down from the center almost 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years ago this summer, 2019. So it was the summer of 2017. Fatima Goss-Graves is the head of the center now. She was she was our senior vice president for program before and had been at the center for 10 years before. So, and she's just a superstar. I don't know if I said explicitly that Duffy Campbell and I left to start the National Women's Law Center, and we became co-presidents of the center.
From the beginning?
From the beginning, we were co-presidents of the National Women's Law Center.
So that was innovative.
And it was, and it evolved generically, and we really wanted to continue our substantive work, and we didn't want to have all of the administrative and fundraising burdens of having that one person would have to have. And so, and we thought of ourselves more in a law firm model than we did as we evolved. And there isn't like usually one person that has a very visible role in law firms. And so we thought that way, and it's probably a very female way, and we were a lot less hierarchical in those days also. But it made a lot of sense by the time that we left that there be one person at
Okay.
the head, and so
Okay.
Fatima is at the head now. So we went from this one person having to figure out how am I going to keep myself busy in 1972 when I started to there are now over 90 people at the National Women's Law Center. And it's just, I obviously Trump has reminded people that there is a lot of work to be done.
Right.
The Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is housed at the National Women's Law Center. And so it's got those 90 people more than busy full time.
Yes, Marcia, would you, that's wonderful history of the National Women's Law Center. Thank you for all of that. 1972, when the center was founded, was a hotbed of feminism in Washington and everywhere around the country. Would you describe for history what that atmosphere was like and working with other people and how the politics worked, and just give us some insights into that experience?
Well, there were, it was so fortunate when I think about having been born when I was and being in a place where I could be in the beginning of this new wave of feminism. And so I got my job because of that wave of feminism, because of the women who were the support staff and the law students who had their list of demands. And I must say they also insisted on interviewing and helping to select the person who would figure out what this Women's Rights Project would do. Washington had also been a place where more women had come to work in the government, which had been discriminatory, there's no doubt about it, but compared to the private sector was much more welcoming. And so there was a much more of a supportive sense of women acting in a way that was collegial than in some other cities. And so when I started in 1972, there had been a Women's Legal Defense Fund that had just been founded the year before. And it was modeled after the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the idea of the civil rights movement and really the key role that lawyers were able to play for movement change. But when the Women's Legal Defense Fund was started, it was all volunteer lawyers. And interestingly enough, a wonderful woman, Brooksley Bourne, who became very prominent in many ways and was the first woman lawyer. And she was brilliant, graduated first in her class from Stanford Law School. She got a clerkship on the same court as my husband a number of years earlier, but with the one judge who would ever take women. There was only one at the time who would. And it was also at a time when Supreme Court justices were assumed not to take women lawyers, and so most of those judges neither had women as clerks to suggest to the clerks, to the Supreme Court justices, etc., or the faculty members didn't promote them. So she went to what has become one of the biggest law firms in the country, Arnold and Porter, and she was the first woman, so far as we know, at a major law firm, national law firm, to make partner working part-time. But she was exceptional and brilliant and ended up winning a Profile and Courage Award because of her work in the government, etc. She was just an extraordinary person. Well, she wrote a speech about all the legal ways that women were disadvantaged, and she gave it to the Junior League in the District of Columbia, which was an organization of very intelligent women, but it was thought to be women of high social standing, certainly Caucasian women. There was no diversity of the Junior League that one would think of at the time. and they were charitably minded, but in the kind of traditional charities, and certainly not thought of as a social activist organization by any means. Well, the women of the DC Junior League were so outraged by Brooksley's speech that they gave her money, and that money was able to be used to hire the first person to work for the Women's Legal Defense Fund, Judy Lichtman.
Okay.
At the same time, when I came to the Center for Law and Social Policy, there were virtually only men on the board, and almost all, male lawyers, and so that didn't seem appropriate. So we set up an advisory board, and Brooke Sleeborn chaired our advisory board and remained the chair of the board of the National Women's Law Center for over 40 years, seeing us through our growth.
Amazing.
And she and another lawyer who became a board member of ours, Marna Tucker, and a very prominent lawyer in family law in this area, taught some of the first women in law classes in Washington, and they taught it at Georgetown, American University, etc. And Marna was working at the American Bar Association, and they became active with the American Bar Association and had nationwide reach and formed a women's group within the ABA, which supported the Equal Rights Amendment, which supported Roe v. Wade, etc. And when I started as one of the first women, early women lawyers in Washington, let alone in the women's movement, the women lawyers in Washington in firms were very few. And we would have lunch together and talk about issues, and could we wear pants to the office, etc. And what was it like to work with the support staff, and we are women and so are they, and yet we need to supervise them, and how do we handle all that as young women, let alone the male partners that were, etc. So there was that component of sisterhood. When I first came, when I was actually at a law firm, then when I was at the National Women's Law Center in '72 and putting this group together, I had ties to some of these women lawyers throughout the government and in private firms who wanted to be supportive. And so some helped us. Barbara Bergman, who was an economist, was an early member of our advisory committee, and she was teaching at AU and developing the theories about equal pay and discrimination in the workplace and how the economy were structured in a way that disadvantaged women. I met Bernice Sandler, who was often called the mother of Title IX, and she was just starting a project for a higher education association to work on women's rights, and she was very, very interested in helping figure out how do we get Title IX enforced, and helping me put the theory of a lawsuit together, one of the first that I brought. It was against what was then Health, Education, and Welfare for not enforcing Title IX, and it took over 3 years for them to issue regulations, and what was then HEW said until they issued regulations under Title IX, they basically weren't going to enforce it. So we brought a lawsuit against them then with Bunny Sandler's help. There was Donna Shavlik, also starting with the American Council on Education, a women's committee to help with, and the foundation world was also beginning to fund women's activities to some degree. Ford Foundation was one of the leaders, and Susan Beresford, who eventually became the president of the Ford Foundation, in those early days was the first program officer, and when I said that we got a grant and were able to hire a second lawyer, it was Susan Beresford that gave us that grant before she ever really was a formal program officer, and she worked her way through the ranks and ultimately became the president of
Wonderful.
the Ford Foundation. There were some women's legal groups starting. The ACLU Women's Rights Project, of course, for one. And talking to Ruth Bader Ginsburg in those early years about issues and cases, etc. There was Equal Rights Advocates in San Francisco. I mentioned the Women's Law Project in Philadelphia in the 70s. When they first got started, I think it was in 74, we were the fiscal agent before they got their tax-exempt status, so that when they got their early grants, they could run through the national, what was the Women's Rights Project of the Center for Law and Social Policy still then, for them to get started. There was a group that Jane Picker started in Cleveland, and so there were few of us, and we were all in touch and talking in those days by phone. There wasn't any emailing or that kind of thing, or probably even faxing in those very early days, but we talked by phone. Then there were the women's groups, and as I said, we started and thought of ourselves as a legal group with clients early on. But we evolved and then began to think of ourselves as a group of activist lawyers that would work on lawsuits and help with legislation and help with getting regulations out, etc. But we were part of the women's movement. And while we were a legal group and part of the legal world to some degree, we began to identify ourselves more and more as part of the legal movement. And so that lawsuit that Bunny Sandler helped us bring, we represented Women's Equity Action League. The National Organization for Women was one of our named plaintiffs in that case. Federation of Organizations for Professional Women, which was getting started to have women's caucuses and all of the professional associations get together and have an umbrella group. American Women in Science. We had 6 different women's organizations that were plaintiffs in our case, suing then HEW for not enforcing Title IX.
Wonderful.
So we picked particular areas to focus on, obviously, with 1 lawyer, then 2 lawyers, then 3 lawyers. We were only 4 lawyers when we started the National Women's Law Center, with law student help, etc., and pro bono help, of course. So we focused on education, employment, health. We got the help of other Center for Law and Social Policy lawyers. When Duffy came, we added a particular area of poverty specifically. But we also would try to get help from the unions. So there was a wonderful woman, Ruth Wyand, who worked for the IUE, electrical workers, and she was trying to bring women's rights cases for the unions and thinking in women's rights terms. And so one of our first cases that I brought in 1974 was against General Electric with Ruth Wyand, who had sued General Electric on behalf of women because their health insurance and disability plans did not include pregnancy and did not even include complications of pregnancy. So if you were out because you had either a routine delivery and couldn't come back to work for, say 6 weeks of a period of disability, or if you had complications, you couldn't be covered. But they covered everything else.
Right.
They covered skiing accidents.
Right.
They covered fights and injuries from fights. They covered every possible other condition. But if it was pregnancy related, no. So we brought that was a form of sex discrimination under Title VII, prohibiting employment discrimination. That case ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and by a divided court, the Supreme Court held that sex discrimination does not include pregnancy discrimination. So we had to go back, and working with the women's movement and all the women's organizations, etc., we passed the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which was passed in 1978 and became effective in 1979. The women's movement became very cohesive, I think, in Washington. There was a coalition for women and girls in education that was formed to try to get the Title IX regs issued. So while we brought the lawsuit, there was also a big coalition working on exerting political pressure and trying to meet with the different secretaries. One of the things that held up those regulations was intercollegiate athletics. Because while Title IX was passed in 1972, and it prohibited sex discrimination in any education program or activity receiving federal funds, there wasn't a lot of, it was passed at a time when there was a feeling that, well, the Equal Rights Amendment may not go anywhere, but at least education, there needs to be equal access to education. But the idea that that was going to mean athletics too, all of a sudden dawned on the athletic establishment.
Right.
And football primarily, but men's basketball and men's sports in general began to think, oh no, we can't have that. So they were lobbying all of HEW and Califano and others not, to exclude athletics from coverage. And there was no legal rationale, and our Coalition for Women and Girls in Education, which had many, many members, all the women's organizations at the time were organized and fighting no. That was part of what we were trying to get.
Right.
And so, in bureaucratic fashion, they just weren't, they were sitting on these regs rather than take on all of the political fights.
Right.
So, finally, with our lawsuit and others, with all of the political pressure, etc., HEW, the then HEW, issued those regulations. They set out basic principles around intercollegiate athletics, but they said that the schools said, we can't understand what these basic principles mean. We can't possibly figure out how to implement it in athletics. And so HEW said, well, we'll give you 3 years to phase in compliance. Well, the way the schools thought of it was 3 years to begin to comply. And then we'll worry about it in 3 years. And in the meantime, we'll try to get amendments passed in Congress. So all the women's groups were fighting that. Wow. And the Women's Sports Foundation was set up. And so there were women's caucuses, women's organizations that were multifaceted, like now. And then there were others that had very specific areas of focus. There was the National Women's Political Caucus in those days, and also trying to get, in a bipartisan way, more women in political office. And so the women's movement had many, many different organizations. And one of, I think, while of course there were the natural rivalries and competition to some degree, I think it was a uniquely cooperative movement during that period of time. And when Carter was elected, there was a big meeting of women's groups and women's leaders. And there were probably 100 women in this room. And we all had met to come up with an agenda of what we would ask the President of the United States. And of course, there were many, many different requests. And one of the things that the Carter administration was doing was sending judicial nominations to the American Bar Association for them to review and see if they were qualified, but also to the National Bar Association, which was an association of African American lawyers that had set up and had national prominence in the days when the American Bar Association was discriminatory. While there were women's bar associations, they didn't have the same kind of public policy orientation. But we wanted to have that same kind of organization, and we got Millie Jeffries from who was at that point the head of the Women's Political Caucus to ask Carter if he would also submit to the women's organization to review judges to be nominations before those nominations were made, to be sure that they had a demonstrated commitment of equal justice, which was a criteria that was in place around women's issues. And he said yes, he would.
Oh my.
And so then we had to create an organization that would do it.
Oops.
And so we set up something called the Federation of Organizations of Professional, the Women's Judicial Screening Panel.
Okay.
And that was the Federation of Organizations of Professional Women, was this broad array of the women's groups that were meeting in Washington, and some that had offices in New York or elsewhere. And then they would each designate somebody who would be part of the screening panel for the different circuits around the country to meet with these potential nominees and have to be asked their views around women's rights and women judges and women lawyers and women on juries, etc. So this was a time of expanding possibilities. There were, of course, always great opponents, whether it was the men's sports or, of course, abortion. Once Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, immediately there was a huge effort to try to cut it back.
Right.
One of the first things we did was have a meeting of organizations to look at Roe v. Wade and the ways that it was vulnerable and how we had to figure out ways of fighting back. And we hosted that meeting for a number of different lawyers from women's organizations and those who were working on reproductive rights to come. The law clerk for Justice Blackmun, who had written the opinion and helped write it with Justice Blackmun, had come to work at the Center for Law and Social Policy. And so that was an example of making use of the quite wonderful lawyers, male and female, that were at the Center for Law and Social Policy in those early days. And, much we predicted, but the fact that we are in this horrendous fight for Roe v. Wade and hanging on the balance with which we thought after Webster and the women's marches is as true as it ever has been, if not more true. So there are fights that I think we've put to rest to some degree. Should women play sports? I think everybody takes great pride in, the women's soccer players, etc., but there's still huge discrimination in pay and opportunities and support and scholarships. All that is still there, but it's night and day compared to what it used to be. But the fight around Roe v. Wade is as intense as ever.
I wonder if we could go on for another day, but we can't. But what would you count as your major accomplishments,
Well, I think probably that case, the Wheel case, which was representing many of the women's organizations, Women's Equity Action League was the first, and so it was called that. It went on for 16 years.
My God.
And we got those regs ultimately pried loose with all of the political fighting when the judge was calling in the Department of Justice lawyer representing then HEW as to why they shouldn't be held liable for not enforcing the law. Then, and we kept, the court kept jurisdiction of the case, and they had to keep reporting to us. We got the athletic clarification regs out. Finally, we got many more things. Finally, pried loose from that case for 16 years.
Amazing.
So I would say not only was our, we were part of the lobbying movement, et cetera, but we brought legal skills to bear. And that was one of the first cases I brought and stuck with that for 16 years. And so I'm very proud of that.
Any major disappointments that you?
Well, I think one of the things that is disappointing is the antipathy and to women's reproductive rights.
Right.
That not only, we're still litigating cases around pregnancy discrimination. We did pass the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and I was a part of that effort, which I'm very proud of. Obviously, growing the Women's Rights Project of the Center for Law and Social Policy until it became the National Women's Law Center, I'm very proud of. And all of our work around sexual harassment I'm very proud of too, which I haven't discussed. But and our work around women's health and the Affordable Care Act, and we had worked with NOW especially, and Twist Butler especially, and her husband, around all of the insurance discrimination and women being charged more than men, and excluding reproductive health care. Pregnancy care was excluded, as well as contraception, as well as abortion. And to this day, opponents of the Affordable Care Act talk about paring it down, and why should pregnancy be covered? These men say, I don't get pregnant, so why should I have to pay for somebody who does, as if men have nothing to do with women getting pregnant. And so, I wish that the huge income inequality that we're only seeing expand with women and children at the bottom end of that income equality, we had been more successful in reducing. And I wish we had also been more successful than we have been in bringing some of the support systems for women to be able to be in the paid workforce, and to change that mindset of the woman who's at home for lunch and then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's how the whole workforce system is envisioned.
Right.
Could be changed for early education, for childcare, for paid family leave, etc. So we have left, I think much to be proud of, but much, much, much work to be done. I think that the only other thing that I want to just make a little bit more explicit is that all of these women's concerns at the lower end of the economic ladder, as well as the glass ceiling barriers that women were facing, have a commonality. And one of the things, to bring it to the Me Too movement, which is so painful today, is to see the depth and the breadth of harassment that, as hard-boiled and as cynical as I thought I had become over all these years, I was taken aback by how much was being reported through the Me Too movement, let alone how much is still unreported, and women still afraid to come forward and tell their story, and properly so. And what was especially empowering was the women in Hollywood who used their voices to discuss their own harassment, wanting very explicitly through Time's Up to set up not only a legal mechanism and a legal defense fund now at the National Women's Law Center to help women at the lower end of the economic spectrum so that McDonald's can be sued, which the center has just done, or representing women at Walmart or some of the other women who have not had the economic wherewithal to protect themselves, but also that they would stand shoulder to shoulder with these women in their fights, and to see the common causes that can be made, and see women starting to run for office in greater numbers. So we saw in 2016 the huge election victories, 2018 rather, especially, and now the big debates about, is this a year where we could actually see a woman as president? But I didn't talk about Hillary Clinton epitomizing this. There were times when we have needed to have a very powerful woman in the room to negotiate for us. And when Hillary was the First Lady of Arkansas that long ago, we turned to her to be in that room along with Vernon Jordan around some civil rights legislation that we were passing, a story that isn't well known, that some of those women who were young associates with me and who then ultimately were able to push through and become partners and become big leaders in the American Bar Association or in the government, like Brooks Lee Bourne or Ann Bingaman, who became the first woman Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust and who became a big advocate for women's rights to this day, or others that women fought to open up these jobs for, are turning around and giving back and not forgetting that they need to support not only their sisters push through, but also those who are less fortunate than they.